All right. Well, good morning. If you have your Bibles, if you would open to Job chapter 33. Job chapter 33 as we continue in our study of the book of Job. We're going to cover a little bit of ground that we covered last week as well as we introduced Elihu, a new character in the narrative of Job. Elihu being a younger man by his own admission to Job and his three friends and bringing a different perspective than what both Job and his three friends would bring when it comes to the suffering that Job is experiencing. Okay, Job's three friends essentially kind of have this view of God that he is going to punish wickedness and he's going to punish it swiftly. He is going to act justly and he's going to do that without us having a doubt of why he's doing that. And so suffering in their minds is direct evidence that there is wickedness in the life of the person. We're not talking about just inward wickedness, but wickedness that works its way outward to the oppression of the poor and to poorly treating people around them, to doing all kinds of horrible things that then God would punish with such suffering as Job is receiving. Job naturally has a problem with this because he has not done any of those things. In fact, he has done the opposite. He has made sure that the people around him are supported by him, are loved by him, are cared for by him. Job has attempted to live his life in such a way that, according to his view of God, that he should be earning blessings from God and more blessings from God rather than the suffering that he's enduring. So Job is stuck in this struggle of trying to understand how he's receiving this suffering when he's been so good. And therefore, Job, in many of his dialogues, has been crying out to God, calling God unfair, and really asking God, listen, I need a court that I can try you in, or at least you can try me in, so that I can see what I'm doing wrong, because I've been doing all the right things. And Elihu apparently has been sitting and listening to these dialogues as these friends and Job go back and forth and arguing their points and really coming to no resolution at all. And then he rebukes both groups of not having represented God well. And we're going to start with how Elihu speaks to Job in his rebuke. This is Job chapter 33, starting in verse 1. But now hear my speech, O Job, and listen to all my words. Behold, I open my mouth. The tongue in my mouth speaks. My words declare the uprightness of my heart, and what my lips know, they speak sincerely. The Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. Answer me if you can. Set your words in order before me. Take your stand. Behold, I am toward God as you are. I too was pinched off from a piece of clay. Behold, no fear of me need terrify you. My pressure will not be heavy upon you. Surely you have spoken in my ears, and I have heard the sound of your words. You say, I am pure. Without transgression, I am clean. There is no iniquity in me. Behold, he finds occasion against me. He counts me as his enemy. He puts my feet in the stocks and watches all my paths. Behold, in this you are not right. I will answer you, for God is greater than man. Why do you contend against him, saying, he will answer none of man's words? For God speaks in one way, and in two, though man does not perceive it. In a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls on men, while they slumber in their beds, then he opens the ears of men and terrifies them with warnings, that he may turn man aside from his deed and conceal pride from a man. He keeps back his soul from the pit, his life from perishing by the sword. Man is also rebuked with pain on his bed, and with continual strife in his bones, so that his life loathes the bread, and his appetite the choicest food. His flesh is so wasted away that it cannot be seen, and his bones that were not seen stick out. His soul draws near the pit, and his life to those who bring death. If there be for him an angel, a mediator, one of the 1,000, to declare to man what is right for him, and he is merciful to him and says, deliver him from going down into the pit. I have found a ransom. Let his flesh become fresh with youth. Let him return to the days of his youthful vigor. Then man prays to God and he accepts him. He sees his faith with a shout of joy, and he restores to man his righteousness. He sings before men and says, I sinned and perverted what was right, and it was not repaid to me. He has redeemed my soul from going down into the pit, and my life shall look upon the light. Behold, God does all these things twice, 3 times with a man to bring back his soul from the pit, that he may be lighted with the light of life. Pay attention, O Job. Listen to me. Be silent, and I will speak. If you have any words, answer me. Speak, for I desire to justify you. If not, listen to me. Be silent, and I will teach you wisdom. So here we have Elihu giving us a new perspective. Okay? That God does not just send suffering or turmoil or fear to a person simply out of judgment, but does so in order to turn mankind from their path. That when man does not perceive that the path that he is walking on is leading to his destruction and away from God, God will, in his love and in his mercy, give something to that man to get his attention. And often, what God uses is suffering. Or as he says, a dream, a vision of things that terrify the man and awaken him to the fact that he's going the wrong direction. So here we see Elihu presenting a type of balance between Job's friends and Job himself. Within Elihu's framework of who God is and how he operates in the world, God is perfectly capable and indeed is gracious and merciful to give suffering to mankind when man, blinded by his own pride, continues to walk in an unrighteous heart towards God. Now, the reason why I emphasize heart is because the man's actions may be right and moral, but his heart may be far from God. As we've listened to the discourse of Job, we hear in his arguments with his friends, we hear that Job has sought to escape the wrath of God by doing good things. If you think back to what Job has probably in his memory or in the memory of the cultures of the great flood that God sent and saved Noah and his family, God bringing judgment on the world because of their wickedness. And so Job, wanting to not let God do that to him, acts rightly, morally, in such a way that he would not deserve that kind of judgment from God. But in this, Job is off because he assumes that he is now deserving in his own righteousness of blessing from God and therefore an escape from any type of suffering. Job is walking in a prideful self-righteousness that is wrapped in morality. And we ought to learn this lesson from Job because we often, especially in church, can get caught in the stream of acting good but not loving God. So acting good in order that God would give us what we want him to give us and we would avoid the certain things that we don't want God to give us. And it's very easy for us to do this because all we have to do is find somebody we can compare ourselves to who's obviously not doing as good a job as we are. And don't we do that all the time? In so many facets of our life. If you work with other employees, you're always judging how well you're doing at your job by the lowest person at your job. Well, I may not be like this guy who's really just a suck-up, but I'm not as bad as this guy who doesn't do anything. It really should be fired, right? And we puff ourselves up. We look for reasons to build ourselves up, and we look for people to step on. We do this often in our walk with the Lord. We justify our heart condition based on the actions of another person and call ourselves righteous and deserving of what we want from God. So this is what Elihu begins to address. He begins to bring balance. Now, much like Job and his friends, Elihu has a very limited scope based on the historical context that he lived in. Elihu, even in this text, points to Christ, but he doesn't know he's pointing to Christ, the mediator that he speaks of in verses 23 and 24, the one who the angelic one, the one who stands between God and man and says, I found a ransom for this man, and his sin, spare his life. Now again, Elihu, much like Job and his 3 friends, The value is highly set on living a long and prosperous life. For us on this side of the cross, we know and understand that this life is not the main thing. That God's blessing is not shown in a long and prosperous life, but rather the life to come. So we see even in Elihu, even though he does bring balance, he is not the perfection, because God has not yet unfolded to mankind what his eternal plan is through the work of Christ on our behalf. Now let's keep reading in verse 1 of chapter 34 as Elihu continues in his discourse. Hear my words, you wise men, and give ear to me, you who know. For the ear tests words as the palate tastes food. Let us choose what is right. Let us know among ourselves what is good. For Job has said, I am in the right, and God has taken away my right. In spite of my right, I am counted a liar. My wound is incurable, though I am without transgression. What man is like Job, who drinks up scoffing like water, who travels in company with evildoers and walks with wicked men? For he has said, it profits a man nothing that he should take delight in God. Now, here Elihu is not necessarily saying that Job by his actions is doing wickedness and walking with evil men, but rather is grouping himself with wicked men by the language coming out of his mouth as Job cries out in his suffering. And what we should remember is that what Job cries out in his suffering is what truly abides in his heart, no matter what his actions may tell us. See, the suffering that Job endures has forced out of him what is truly in him, and that is he believes that he is perfect. He believes that he is nailing it. He believes that God should love having him on his team because he's doing so well. And of course, we know that to be pride. We know that to be against and in rebellion to God himself, instead of being humble and accepting his grace, because we are not perfect even in our morality. So Elihu here is not necessarily putting Job in the same place that his friends tried to put him, as if he is acting wickedly and actively being wicked, and as far as being immoral. But rather grouping him because of what is coming out of Job's heart through his mouth as he cries out because of his suffering. Keep going. Therefore, hear me, you men of understanding. Far be it from God that he should do wickedness, and from the Almighty that he should do wrong. For according to the work of a man he will repay him, and according to his ways he will make it befall him. Of a truth, God will not do wickedly, and the Almighty will not pervert justice. Who gave him charge over the earth, and who laid on him the whole world? If he should set his heart to it, and gather to himself his spirit and his breath, all flesh would perish together, and man would return to the dust. If you have understanding, hear this. Listen to what I say. Shall one who hates justice govern? Will you condemn him who is righteous and mighty, who says to a king, worthless one, and to nobles, wicked man, who shows no partiality to princes, nor regards the rich more than the poor, for they are all the work of his hands. In a moment they die. At midnight the people are shaken and pass away, and the mighty are taken away by no human hand. So here, Elihu once again defies the perspective, especially of Job's three friends, and most likely the perspective of Job before his suffering. That somehow power, influence, and stuff means blessing from the Almighty, as if God is showing them favor and giving them that blessing, showing them partiality because of how good they are, how smart they are, how strong they are, instead of the truth of who God is, that he shows no partiality to anyone, and he will just as soon snuff a king as a poor man. So again, Elihu is bringing balance to their perspectives, and what he is doing is he is elevating God above man instead of making God a part of the machine that is man and society, which Job and his three friends desperately want to do, because then we can work God as we want him to work, instead of God being holy and different and being able to see things and understand things that we cannot. Verse 21. For his eyes are on the ways of man, and he sees all his steps. There is no gloom or deep darkness where evildoers may hide themselves. For God has no need to consider a man further, that he should go before God in judgment. He shatters the mighty without investigation and sets others in their place. Thus, knowing their works, he overturns them in the night, and they are crushed. He strikes them for their wickedness in a place for all to see, because they turned aside from following him and had no regard for any of his ways. So that they caused the cry of the poor to come to him, and he heard the cry of the afflicted. When he is quiet, who can condemn? When he hides his face, who can behold him? Whether it be a nation or a man, that a godless man should not reign, that he should not ensnare the people. For has anyone said to God, I have borne punishment, I will not offend any more. Teach me what I do not see, for I have done iniquity, I will do it no more. Will he then make repayment to suit you, because you reject it? For you must choose, and not I. Therefore I declare what you know. Men of understanding will say to me, and the wise man who hears me will say, Job speaks without knowledge, his words are without insight. Would that Job were tried to the end, because he answers like wicked men. For he adds rebellion to his sin. He claps his hands among us and multiplies his words against God. Here Elihu is pointing to the fact that because Job continually demands God to come to court with him, that Job is misunderstanding God as if God has somehow missed something. I want to say that again. Job, in his arguments, demands God to come to court because Job is implying that God has somehow missed the evidence that should have let Job escape from his suffering. Job, in the bitterness of his suffering, twists God and demands that God come down to his level. And Elihu says, this is no such God. The God that we've heard, the God that you say that you serve, is not a God who misses anything. As if he needed a hearing to be able to see all the evidence and then be able to say, oops, my bad, let me give you back your prosperity and take away your suffering. Now, this sounds silly to us, like, of course, God doesn't need all that stuff. We know God to be all-knowing, but don't we do this? Don't we often assume that God has missed something in our lives and therefore has allowed us to suffer? Or don't we assume, like Job's friends, that we've done something wrong and we just have to endure the punishment? See, brothers and sisters, what Elihu is trying to point Job to, and what the scriptures in their entirety are going to more clearly state to us, is that God is gracious to give us what we need to see him. And that often what we need to see him most clearly are trials and suffering. Because if left to simple prosperity, we will see ourselves as God more than him. This same Job, who is so confident in his own righteousness, is the same Job that God called blameless and upright at the beginning of the book. This is the same Job who is kept all the way through this suffering. who here in not too long is going to be met by God himself. Job is God's, and he still is caught in self-righteousness whenever suffering hits. And Elihu is drawing us back to the truth of who God is. Again, Elihu is not speaking perfectly of God. He does not yet have the fullness of the revelation that God will continue to unfold throughout history leading to Christ. But he certainly has a better perspective and a more full and complete perspective of who God is, given his historical context. And honestly, if we could be honest with ourselves at certain points in our lives, and maybe even today, he has a much clearer picture, even in his ignorance, than often we do, despite the fact that we have multiple translations of the Bible, that we have so many Bible studies that we've been through, that we've been to Sunday school, we've been to all these things, and yet we still struggle to see God for who he is. Because we still, in our heart of hearts, have to fight the urge to make God more like we want him to be rather than accept him for who he is. Let's go on to chapter 35. And Elihu answered and said, "Do you think this to be just? Do you say it is my right before God that you ask, what advantage have I? How am I better off than if I had sinned? I will answer you and your friends with you. Look at the heavens and see, and behold the clouds, which are higher than you. If you have sinned, what do you accomplish against him? And if your transgressions are multiplied, what do you do to him? If you are righteous, what do you give to him? Or what does he receive from your hand? Your wickedness concerns a man like yourself, and your righteousness a son of man. Because of the multitude of oppressions, people cry out. They call for help because of the arm of the mighty, but none says, where is God my maker, who gives songs in the night, who teaches us more than the beasts of the earth and makes us wiser than the birds of the heavens? There they cry out, but he does not answer because of the pride of evil men. Now I want to stop here because this is something vitally important for us, brothers and sisters. How often in the midst of suffering have we felt like our prayers are just hitting and bouncing off the walls? Right? How often have we felt a helplessness in our crying out to God in our prayers because of this very thing? The response in our heart is not worship of God for who he is and asking for strength to bear what he has given, but rather, God, you have wronged me. You have missed it. You have messed up somewhere because I was doing good and then you gave me this instead of what I wanted. And how often in our prayers do we cry out, God, give me what I want, because I don't have enough without that. Brothers and sisters, that is not simply the prayers of the unbeliever. If we are not careful, those will be our prayers, even when we are his, when we have not remembered who God is. Brothers and sisters, there are some prayers that God will not, it's hard to say here, because obviously he knows what we are praying. He's not blind to those things. But when we come to God in pride, in rebellion, do we think that God is going to take our prideful pleading and then somehow give us what we selfishly want? Would that be good parenting? Because I'll tell you, I know that if any of us had a 2-year-old coming up with a little tantrum saying what they need that piece of candy, and you better give me that piece of candy, we're not giving that to them. That's not good parenting. No, we're probably not even going to let them finish before they're in timeout. And they're definitely not getting that piece of candy. And then good parents, what will we do? We'll walk with that child out of that. Not give them the candy, though. And we're going to do what else? We're going to help them know how to come back to us. Right? What Elihu is teaching us here. He's giving us this balance that why would we think God would hear and why God would deal with us in such a way that he is rewarding our pride and our rebellion against him. Now again, God is not a God who would just turn us away and ignore us. No, he's a loving Father who will continue to give us things that will move us away from our pride and humble us before him to where we are pleading more for him than for stuff. Keep going. We're going to pick up again in verse 13 of chapter 35. Surely God does not hear an empty cry, nor does the Almighty regard it. How much less when you say that you do not see him, that the case is before him and you are waiting for him. And now, because his anger does not punish and he does not take much note of transgression, Job opens his mouth in empty talk. He multiplies words without knowledge. The heart of Elihu's argument is a question that we all must answer as we walk with the Lord. Are you okay with God being God? Are you, Christian or non-Christian, are you okay with God being God? The non-Christian is going to say, no, I'm not okay with God being God. I need God to work for me. The Christian is going to verbally assent to that and then still struggle in their heart to let him be God. That's the normative experience for human beings. Why? Because our heart inclination is to want to be God ourselves. We have to work and be sanctified to get that out of us. And brothers and sisters, it's not going to happen until he makes us perfect. There may be varying degrees as we grow and mature. Yes and amen. But every morning that we wake up, we are to deny ourselves and our need to be God and surrender to what he has for us. Too often, suffering exposes this in us. It exposes not a heart that is allowing God to be God, but a heart that wants to be God and let God work for us. So the question we must often ask ourselves is, brother and sister, are you okay with God being God in your life? And that whatever he brings, whatever he gives, you are content knowing he is still God. Because see, there are things that we know about God up here, especially if you've been around church for any amount of time. We know God is good. We know God is just. We know God is love. We know all of these wonderful things that we like to put on coffee cups and Christian t-shirts and other crazy things. Like, I don't know why you would ever need that put on a flashlight. I don't know why you need that. And we're often happy to know those things because they sound really good. But when push comes to shove in our lives, we don't often really believe them. Because let suffering come into our lives, and what's the first thing we have? Does God still love me? Heck, some of us, whenever suffering is hit, we've asked, God, are you there? Do you even exist? Because this hurts. How dare we? Christian, how dare we? Because something gets uncomfortable for us. We now doubt all that we've believed about him. Now listen, brothers and sisters, I am not at all saying that there is not room for struggle in the Christian life. We see this in Job, don't we? I'm not saying that there's not room and that God is not gracious with us in that. But brothers and sisters, it's time to move on and let God be God. And we must confess together. That's hard. That's hard. But the Bible is going to give us multiple places where we see God's sovereign rule over all things. Daniel chapter 4, we read this just a few weeks ago. Daniel chapter 4, starting in verse towards the end of 34. I bless the Most High and praised and honored him. This is Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing. Boy, that's good for your self-esteem, isn't it? And he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? But that's a hard one for us, isn't it? Let suffering, let trials come. And what's one of the first questions? God, what did you do? Like you missed something here. Romans chapter 9. Starting in verse 14. What shall we say then? Is there injustice on God's part? By no means. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. Are you okay with a God like that? That you can trust him to show mercy to you at just the right time. And not a moment before. Paul doesn't stop there. So then it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who has mercy. The scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I have raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So then he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills. Are you okay with a God like that? Verse 19, you shall say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Now, our enlightenment, we're children of the enlightenment, our reasonable nature, we have rights, we're Americans, we don't like that. Right? We want to be able to question God, and he needs to give us an explanation. We've earned that, right? We have rights. We're owed something from God. Paul says, listen, you can question God all you want, but who are you? Daniel chapter 4, you're accounted as nothing compared to God. Who are you? will what is molded say to its molder, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use? What if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction in order to make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory, even us whom he has called, not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles. Now here, Paul is specifically talking about salvation. And the work of salvation by God's grace. Are we able to trust the God who shows mercy and the God who hardens? And the answer for us must be yes. And all the struggle that comes along with that. Because if we cannot, then we don't trust the God of the Bible. And we, like Job's friends, must create a God for ourselves. And just because we name him Jesus doesn't make it so. The walk of faith is a continual walk of learning how to trust a God who is God alone. Not God with us as his counselor for our lives. Now listen to the words of Jesus. In John chapter 16. Right? This is the loving Jesus, the gracious Jesus. Jesus who's just nice to everyone and just loves everyone. And listen to these words from Christ. John chapter 16, verse 33. I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. Okay? Listen to that. Jesus speaks this way to his disciples before he goes to the cross, letting them know that, listen, hard things are coming, but rest in me, abide in me, be in me, because it's going to be hard for you. I have said these things to you that in me you may have peace. I love that he says these words even though they're really, really hard. In the world you will have tribulation. While we are here in this time, we are going to have trouble. And sometimes that trouble is going to be from the world because we're following Christ and they are not. Sometimes that trouble is going to be because we're living in a fallen world and things happen to our bodies and things happen to people that we love that we can't control. And sometimes that's going to be because we're fallen. And he has not yet made us completely perfect, and we have to struggle with this God who is God. In this world, you will have tribulation, but take heart. I have overcome the world. The promise of Christ is not that this life will be easy, smooth, comfortable, prosperous. The promise of Christ is that especially when it's not, he is our peace. And he has overcome every trouble, every struggle, every pain in this life. Look with me at Revelation chapter 21. Now we're moving here into areas of both God's revelation and theology that Job and his friends don't have. And yet, by God's presence in their lives, he has revealed some. enough that Elihu is able to bring balance to some of the things that Job is experiencing and that his friends can't answer. But God has revealed it to us. Revelation 21, starting in verse 1, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. And he who was seated on the throne said, behold, I am making all things new. Can you trust him for that? Can you trust that every struggle, every moment of suffering here is doing the work of making all things new? Behold, I am making all things. And he said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give from the spring of the water of life without payment. The one who conquers will have this heritage, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, as for murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. Brothers and sisters, there is after this life two ways that we will give glory to the God who is God. We will either give glory by being vessels of his wrath, punished justly for our sin and rebellion against him. Or we will be vessels of his grace, having been cleansed not by our work, but by the work of Christ. Having endured, as Paul says in Philippians 3, the suffering of losing all other things, that we may know Christ and the power of his resurrection. Brothers and sisters, there are so many things in our lives that will cause the question of are we okay with God being God to be pushed to the forefront of our hearts and minds. So many struggles where we will be tempted to reach back to wanting God to be our God that we have made and that works for us, and not allow him to be God on our behalf. For us, we are to reach, trust, put our hope and faith on the God who is God. And even when suffering hits, he is not out of control, but is doing something to make us new. And the promise that we have is that no matter what we endure in this life, he will one day finish that completely. where there will be no more struggle, there will be no more pain, there will be no more suffering. Can you trust him now for what he has prepared for us then? Brothers and sisters, this is the walk of faith. This is the journey that we are all on together. And we need his word, we need his spirit, and we need each other to help us. When suffering hits our lives, when struggle hits, we need to be reminded that God is God and we can trust him in that. May it be that as we leave this place this morning, may it be that we are ready, more ready, to allow God to be God in our lives, to walk with one another in patience and in grace as we continue to point one another to him. And may it be that we, as Christ has made a way, are able to find peace in him, no matter what trials or suffering this life may bring.